Ashish, I would like to ask you to give your presentation on critical and alternative perspectives to the US perspective of a Green New Deal.
Thank you. Thanks, Leonard and Chiara and everybody at Climate Buddies for this opportunity, and Nasreen for your presentation. Well, before I say anything about my critical perspectives on the Green New Deal, I should emphasize that to me it was very disappointing also that Sanders was not nominated for the presidential candidate, and that and of course I greatly admire the way in which Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez has what should I say, revitalized American politics in a positive way and in a very bold way, as a feminist and many other things that she is. So everything I say now is should be seen in that light. I think, firstly, I think what I think is positive about the Green New Deal. I'm speaking here about the 50-page or 60-page proposal that Sanders made as part of his manifesto when he was standing for presidential candidate. And to some extent also the Green New Deal document that the UK Labour Party produced. They're somewhat similar, but also with some differences. And to me, both of them, and especially Sanders' document, was possibly amongst the world's most progressive manifestos coming out from a mainstream politician. A lot of it read like a climate justice NGO movement's manifesto, and I think there was some very good and strong focus. The fact that climate crisis was running all through the document, and also that there was a focus on just transition. So it wasn't just a mechanical or technological way of looking at the climate crisis, but also in terms of social justice and so on, which Nasreen has also pointed out. I also like the fact that there was finally in the US, which is very, very much of a navel gazing society, but finally in the document, there was some emphasis on global peace, on renegotiating international trade deals, and so on. So that's all very positive, and I what I say now should not take away from that. Where I think I see fundamental flaws, and I will try and present the alternatives emerging from places like India, which try and address those flaws. Two or three. One, there's no fundamental challenge to consumption patterns that at least I noticed. Now we can say that let's replace all fossil fuels by renewable energy. In itself, it's good. But if we don't actually challenge the demand on energy itself, the ever increasing demand on energy, renewable energy also becomes extremely destructive. It is ecologically very, very damaging when you're thinking about it at very large scales. You can see this in many parts of the world where either it's biofuels or it's large scale solar energy or energy or whatever, which is wind energy, which is actually dispossessing communities from their land, displacing people, and destroying natural ecosystems in many parts of the world. So there has to be, as part of any such new deal, a fundamental challenge to consumption. How much can we consume? How much can the earth actually take is very fundamental to this. Even, for instance, you take the Sanders promise that we will shift to everybody to electric cars. Now, if all of America has electric cars, that's a huge ecological impact on something somewhere in the world, because cars are not made out of air. You need metal, you need all kinds of things, and even the electricity that's produced, if it's ever increasing, has to come from somewhere. So I think that's a very that's one of the fatal flaws in what I read. The second one, and this relates to the first one also, is the issue of north-south inequalities. One of the biggest problems with the shift towards so-called green living in Europe and North America and Japan and South Korea and so on, is that a lot of the ecological impacts are offshored. They are then coming from outside. So for instance, Japan significantly increases its forest cover, much of Europe is increasing it or sustaining it because they get a lot of hardwoods or other things from other parts of the world. So the global ecological impact of the greening of the North is something that also is very important, and it's missing from this, from the Green New Deal vision that at least that I've seen. And third, and finally, before I get into my alternatives is that I think the notion of democracy itself. So Nasreen was very right in pointing to the need to bring into office somebody who is not Trump, anybody but Trump. Okay, that's fine. But the thing is that we have focused so far only on political parties and on electoral democracy. Whereas in fact, if you look at the original meaning of democracy, it is where each one of us have the Faustine, can you mute your? Yes, thank you. It's where every one of us has the power to take decisions, and we take that power, we claim that power wherever we are. And it seems to me that the Sanders deal is flawed in focusing on nation states, on a country, on a government, on a centralized government, a relatively centralized government, to actually take all of this forward, instead of saying that we will significantly decentralize, we'll give autonomous power to down to neighborhoods and village communities and so on, which is, I think, what we need. Well, in fact, the state also is accountable to that downward democracy. In India, one of the slogans that some communities in central India have, that as we elect the government in New Delhi, in our village, we are the government. I don't see that notion of democracy in the Green New Deal. And I think these are sort of fundamental problems also of a somewhat conventional socialism model. So even as we challenge capitalism, as we must, bringing in a state socialism is also flawed to my mind. Let me now move for the next few minutes to looking at what kind of alternatives are emerging from the global south. And for this, I'm going to try and share some slides. So I call that a global rainbow New Deal, not a Green New Deal, because to my mind, green, even though with the Sanders proposal, it's a combination of ecology and social justice, it still doesn't go far enough, as I've tried to point out. And to me, a rainbow is where all kinds of different aspects of justice, ecological justice, intergenerational justice, interspecies justice, the struggles of women, the struggles of different sexualities, of LGBTQ plus, etc. All of that kind of comes together. And so what we see is actually radical movements of this kind in many different parts of the world, where they're challenging the fundamentals of the system we're in, which is not just with capitalism, but also with patriarchy, also with racism, also with casteism, and also with state domination. And I think learning from these various different communities, I'll give a link in a chat about a book that we produced last year called Pluriverse, which has 100 such examples from different parts of the world. What we learn is that the kind of transformations that people are attempting and that we need much more of is in 5 intersectional spheres. So radical democracy is really what I was saying earlier, that we claim the power where we are. We are the decision makers, and we make governments, insofar as they exist, accountable to us, rather than they're having centralized power. And when you do that, you actually start realizing, you take that to its logical conclusion, you start realizing that even current political boundaries, for instance, nation state political boundaries, don't make sense. To me, the boundary between US and Mexico, for instance, does not make sense. And similarly in South Asia, between India and Bangladesh and India and Pakistan, does not make any ecological or cultural sense, and we have to challenge it. The second part of that is the economic democracy, which is that where communities are, that means of production in the hands of producers, consumption in the hands of consumers, and bringing back the economy of caring and sharing, not focusing only on monetary transactions or financial transactions, and recommoning. This is also something that's absolutely important, and especially in a country like the US, which is so heavily privatized. How do we recommon nature, natural ecosystems, and knowledge? Very, very important that, in fact, we bring knowledge back into the commons from the kind of intellectual property rights and patenting that has taken place, which the US has led on. The third crucial part of this is social justice. And as I said, this is something that's already emphasized in the Green New Deal. A lot more focus on those who are currently marginalized in different parts of the world. There are different kinds of people, but broadly, women, children, so-called disabled people, elderly, landless people in India, Dalits, and indigenous peoples, and so on and so forth. The fourth crucial aspect of this transformation would be cultural diversity and knowledge diversity. Again, this is so important. I didn't see much of this focus in the documents. The importance of multiple knowledge systems, the importance of decolonizing our minds. If you saw the map that I showed you earlier, it is what most people think is upside down. It's not upside down. It's basically that the so-called normal map we're used to is a colonial time map where Europe was shown to be on top and shown much bigger than it actually is, whereas in fact the actual sizes of the continents are what you see on this map. So decolonizing the knowledge systems, epistemologies, ways of knowing, ways of being, and understanding that there's a pluriverse of this across the world which needs to be respected. And finally, of course, ecological resilience and wisdom. And I think there it's not just climate. The climate crisis is huge, it's massive, it's the biggest crisis we have, but it should not hide the fact that there's an even prior crisis of biodiversity, of pollution, and so on and so forth, which is equally important to focus on. And I'm actually surprised that Sanders' Green New Deal says very little on that. At the core of this flower of transformation, and then I'll end, and that's where I think our movements, whether it's the Sunrise Movement or the movements I'm talking about from India, can actually see common ground, because we can't replicate each other's movements. But we can see common ground in terms of the values, the principles, the ethics that we rely on. And I think any New Deal has to be fundamentally based on this and other ethics. This is just a limited set of them. But for instance, fourth point, cooperation and commons instead of competition and privatization. Or the sixth point, which is so important in the COVID context, that labor of any kind is considered to be dignified. Physical labor is as dignified as mental labor. Or take the third last point, it's not just human rights, but also the rights of nature. Emerging from the Indian context through Gandhi, for instance, the importance of non-violence, of autonomy, of we call it Swaraj here, of freedom, of self-determination, and so on, down to the level of the local community, not just at the level of nation states.